Rain hammered the windshield in sheets when Ethan Reyes saw the hazard lights blinking weakly on the shoulder of Route 9. 9 hours earlier, the same company that owned every mile of that highway had handed him a box and a handshake goodbye. He slowed anyway. He always slowed anyway. When the window rolled down and mascara ran down a stranger's face, he froze for half a second, because he knew that face. It belonged to the woman who had signed his termination letter that very morning. She had no idea who he was. Stick around, because the moment she finds out changes everything that comes next. The morning had started the way it always did. Ethan clocked in at 6:40, coffee in a dented thermos, boots still wet from the walk across the lot at Hale Freight Solutions. 6 years on that floor, and he still checked the shipment logs before anyone asked him to. By 8:15 he was called upstairs. Nobody on the floor ever got called upstairs for good news. Victoria Hale sat behind a glass desk, reading from a page someone else had written for her, her voice careful in the way people are careful when they don't want to be the one saying it. Beside the window stood Preston Marsh, arms folded, watching Ethan like a man clearing out a shelf. Ethan folded the letter once and slipped it into his jacket without a word. He asked only one question: would his benefits carry through the month, for his daughter's sake? Victoria's pen paused. Marsh cleared his throat. She wrote a note on the folder and said nothing else. Ethan picked up 8-year-old Maddie from school that afternoon, right on time, lunchbox rattling, her voice running through a whole day in 20 directions. He didn't mention the box behind his seat, a stapler, a chipped mug, a photo of her mother he used to keep on his desk. That night, after Maddie fell asleep with a book still open on her chest, Preston Marsh called Victoria to say the restructuring had gone smoothly and the quarterly numbers would look better for it. Victoria sat on her kitchen counter with a folder of names she hadn't read closely enough, telling herself this was simply what leadership looked like. She left the office long after everyone else, buried in budget reviews that bled into each other without end. The rain started an hour before she reached the county stretch outside town, and her dashboard lights died along with the engine. Her phone was dead too, forgotten under 3 meetings. That's when headlights slowed behind her. Ethan sat with his engine idling for a moment, recognizing the car, recognizing her, from the framed photo in the lobby he'd walked past for years under the words new leadership, new direction. Something old and sharp rose in his chest. Then he let it go. This wasn't the woman who fired him. This was a person alone on a dark road at midnight, and there was no version of himself that could drive past that. He stepped into the storm and knocked 2 knuckles against her window. Battery trouble, he asked, hands raised, harmless. She nodded, too tired to explain, and watched him walk back for jumper cables without asking his name. Under the raised hood, soaked through, Ethan worked with the calm of a man who'd fixed far worse than a dead battery. Where did you learn to do that? She asked when the engine finally turned over. Navy, he said. Used the one word. He didn't mention the years designing logistics systems for forward bases overseas, or the patent that still carried his name in a government filing somewhere. She thanked him, shivering under a coat that had done nothing against the rain, entirely unaware that the man in front of her had been unemployed by her own signature that same morning. For the first time all day, she felt something other than exhaustion. A stranger had stopped and asked for nothing. He offered to follow her to the nearest station so she wouldn't be stranded twice before morning, and she agreed, checking her mirror twice on the drive, half expecting his headlights to peel away the way convenient kindness usually did. They didn't. At the station, under buzzing fluorescent light, 2 coffees cooling between them, she held out her hand. Tori, she said. Ethan, he answered, giving his full name without hesitation, because lying about who he was had never occurred to him. She didn't recognize it. She'd signed off on dozens of names that week, faster than any single face could stick. It was simply a stranger who'd pulled over when almost anyone else would have kept driving. They talked while they waited, easier than 2 people who'd met an hour ago should. She asked what he did, and he said, honestly enough, that he'd recently left a warehouse job, not a lie, just not the whole truth yet. She talked about inheriting a company she still felt like she was only pretending to run. He mentioned Maddie once, the volcano project, missing her mother some days more than others. Tori's face softened in a way that clearly surprised her. When the tow truck pulled away with her car, Ethan drove her to the hotel where she'd been staying through house renovations. They ride past in a long, comfortable silence neither of them felt the need to fill. Dramatic pause. He drove home that night replaying pieces of the conversation, unsettled by how good it felt to be listened to by someone who knew nothing about the worst part of his day. He told himself he'd fix it soon, on his own terms. She called him 2 days later using the number from the tow paperwork, inviting him to dinner as a simple thank you. He accepted, weighing quietly whether to tell her the truth first. He decided she deserved to hear it face to face, not over a phone call. At the small downtown restaurant, candles flickering every time the door opened, conversation came easier than either expected. She asked about his job situation again. He stayed vague, watching her face for any flicker of recognition that never came. She told him about board members who doubted her, about a company she was terrified of running into the ground. When she mentioned a warehouse efficiency problem her operations team had struggled with for months, he offered a fix so precise, so clearly rooted in first-hand knowledge of the floor, that she paused mid-sentence and studied him. He waved it off as something from a documentary, and she let it go, though the moment stayed with her longer than she admitted. Before the night ended, she asked if he'd want to get coffee again, no occasion required. He said yes and meant it, even as the weight of what he hadn't told her pressed harder with every unguarded laugh she gave him. Driving home, he passed the exit for Hale Freight Solutions and slowed without meaning to, staring up at the lit sign. He knew what he had to do. He just needed the right moment. Across town that same night, Preston Marsh met a supplier in a nearly empty diner, sliding an envelope of cash across the table with practiced ease. Shipping contract numbers had been quietly inflated for months, the difference disappearing into private accounts, and Marsh had used the recent restructuring as cover, trimming away the one man sharp enough to have noticed the math didn't add up. 2 days later, Ethan asked Tori to meet him at a quiet park by the river, nowhere to hide behind small talk. He told her plainly, his name was Ethan Reyes, he'd worked in her warehouse 6 years, and she had personally signed his termination letter the same morning she later got stranded on that county road. Her expression moved from confusion to disbelief to something close to shame, and he didn't look away from any of it. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, voice tight. "Because that night, you didn't need to know who I was," he said quietly. "You needed someone to stop the car." Before she could answer, Walter Combs approached from a nearby bench, a manila folder in hand. Ada reached out to Ethan after hearing whispers in HR about irregularities tied to the restructuring, unable to stay quiet any longer so close to his own retirement. Inside were emails and timestamps lining up with uncomfortable precision. Marsh had flagged Ethan's name for termination weeks before the official announcement, citing a note about contract discrepancies Ethan had quietly questioned during a routine audit. It had never been a simple layoff. It had been timed to happen before he could raise the issue through proper channels. Tora read through it twice, her hands tightening around the folder's edges as the shape of it became impossible to ignore. She thought of every hesitant instinct she'd overridden because Marsh's confidence felt safer than her own judgment. "I need to make this right," she said quietly, more to herself than either man. Walter admitted he could lose his own job for coming forward, that his wife's coverage depended on staying employed, but he'd seen Ethan laughing with his daughter at the grocery store one evening and couldn't stay silent after that. Tori assured him immediately that nothing today would cost him his position. The next morning, she called an emergency meeting under the pretense of a routine budget review. Marsh walked in confident, until his eyes landed on the folder open across her desk. He denied everything at first, sharp and practiced, until Ethan stepped forward, calm but unmistakably firm, laying out 6 years in the warehouse, 4 in the Navy, 2 patents still active with federal contractors. "A man who accounted for every bolt in a war zone," Ethan said, "tends to notice when the math on a domestic freight contract doesn't add up." Marsh's composure cracked, and in trying to discredit him, he admitted details about the inflated contracts that matched Walter's folder line for line. 2 attorneys waiting in the next room, having heard enough through the open door, stepped in. Tora suspended Marsh on the spot. 3 days later she stood before the full board, laying out the falsified contracts and the retaliatory termination without excuses, taking full responsibility for what she'd missed while making clear who bore the deeper blame. One senior board member asked pointedly about legal exposure. There likely is some, Tora said, and I intend to make it right regardless, because the right thing and the safest thing aren't always the same decision, and I know which one I want to be known for. They vote to remove Marsh passed unanimously. When the meeting closed, Dodie asked Ethan to stay. Board members still gathered near the door. She apologized to him there, in front of the people who mattered to the company's direction, deliberately wanting it witnessed. She offered him a new role leading operational engineering, built around exactly the skills that had been dismissed weeks earlier. I'll take it, he said. But not because you owe me anything. Because I'm right for it. She nodded, something like real respect passing between them. Months later, rain fell against the office windows the way it had the night they met. Maddie slept on the couch in the corner after another late pickup. Tora sat across from Ethan's desk, watching the rain trace the glass. Do you ever regret stopping that night, she asked, knowing everything you'd find out? He didn't have to think about it. I'd stop for you exactly the same way, every time. Neither of them said anything else for a while. Her hand rested near his on the desk, and this time, neither one pulled away.